Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History 1302. This week, we're going to be talking about my favorite subject, which is World War I. That's actually what I wrote my thesis on, and it is, kind of my area of expertise, and I really just love talking about World War I. So let's jump into it. Now, it was probably a couple of years ago that I had a student, raise his hand and he was like, just out of curiosity, why World War I? And honestly, I had never been asked that. Like, I hadn't even asked myself that. And I was kind of like, why do I love World War I so much? And so I had to really think about it. And I guess to put it simply, World War I spoke to me on a level that no other part of history had. And to be frank, it's unlike any war before it or any war after it. And I think that's what I really like about it. See, World War I is truly the last gentleman's war. It's the last time we see troops on both sides of the war just stop fighting because it's Christmas and they don't want to. It's also the, last time that we see, just ceasefire so that way we can collect the dead. And it's, sorry, my dog is barking. It's also one of the last times that, we have pictures of the countries who are fighting and their men are just standing in no man's land, and, they're drinking coffee together. They're, not necessarily speaking to one another because they didn't know each other's languages, but they're just kind of taking time not only to collect their dead, but also to just be out of the trenches and be normal. It's one of the only wars in history where the troops in the trenches felt like they had more in common with each other, so with the people who were in the trench across from them, technically their enemy, than they did with the people back home or with their country or whatever that was. And that makes World War I unique in my opinion. It's one of those, it's kind of like a brotherhood thing. You know how you always hear people in the military talk about this brotherhood? Well, because trench warfare was so gritty and because it was so terrible, I guess you could say, the guys in the trenches, they had more in common with each other than they did with the people back home or the empires that had sent them to fight. And yeah, so I guess when, somebody asks me why World War I, my answer to that is that it fundamentally changed warfare, but more importantly, it fundamentally changed society. And that's one of the many things that I love about wars, is what I specifically study is how warfare changed society. And World War I it sets the stage for the 20th century. I mean, haven't you ever wondered why poisonous gas is illegal? You can't use it on battlefields or against civilians or anything like that. And specifically in World War II, because poisonous gas was such a big deal in World War I. Well, the reason why it wasn't used so much in World War II, obvious exceptions being the Holocaust, but the reason why it's one of those things that the world frowns upon is because poisonous gas was so terrible, that the League of Nations put an end to its use at the Geneva Convention in 1925. And that's because poisonous gas, you would inhale it and it would burn your esophagus on the way down, and then it would get into your lungs. And the way that you would die from mustard gas is you would slowly cough up bits of your lung until you died, until you essentially suffocated to death because you had no lungs. And they decided that that was just too horrific, okay? It was so bad that it is now against the rules of war. The rules of war, right? State-sanctioned murder, the rules of war. It is so bad we can't use it, okay? And that comes directly from World War I. And, a big part of the reason why, the changes in society have to do with the fact that Europe lost an entire generation of its young men. I mean, a whole generation. In France, 6 out of every 10 men between the ages of 18 and 29 were killed or permanently maimed. 6 in every 10, more than 50%. 60% of the men who fought in World War II were killed or they were maimed. And that's a really high number. That's unusually high even for like World War II. Approximately 80,000 British soldiers were treated for shell shock over the course of the war. And despite its prevalence throughout this war, it's basically going to be attributed to moral failings, and weakness, mental weakness on the part of the soldier, not because of warfare. And a lot of these soldiers are going to be accused of cowardice, of desertion, and they're going to be executed because of it. And by the end of this war, it's going to have spread to 6 different continents. It's going to have destroyed 37 million lives, 8.5 of which are going to be combat deaths. And we're going to see the mobilization of over 65 million men, which was the largest to that point in history. And we see the destruction of 4 age-old European empires. And that's a lot. It just fundamentally changes society. And that is one of the many things that I love about World War I is how the war impacts everyday people, how it impacted, the empires, policy, and all of those things. Because ultimately what the First World War did is it shook the political balance of Europe. It interrupted its economic growth. It destroyed an entire generation of its youth. It decimated age-old empires. But while all that tragedy is happening over in Europe, the United States is basically flourishing. And I mean, we experience a boom in industry. Because of the war effort, right? War, boom in industry because Europe needs stuff. We see the progression of a women's movement as they move into the labor force and they refuse to, work and support a country that doesn't allow them the right to vote. We also see the rise of new diplomatic policies that are going to bring reform and democracy to the rest of the world. Originally, most Americans are going to look at World War I. They're going to look at the conflict in Europe and they're going to think, this has little to do with us. And they're going to look on in horror as this war became what many people are going to claim is the most savage one in history. Of course, we know better, don't we? So the first thing that we're going to look at is actually going to be the 4 indirect causes of World War I and then the 1 direct cause of World War I. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about is militarism. And militarism is a philosophy or a system that emphasizes the importance of military power. Now, there was a German historian who served in World War I. His name was Alfred Vagatz, and he defined it as, quote, the domination of the military man over the civilian, an undue preponderance of military demands, an emphasis on military considerations. Now, essentially what that means is it's the military over the civilian populace, period. So military first, everything else second. Now, essentially what happens is in the 20th century, this inspires an arms race. An arms race is kind of like countries trying to create the best tech in order to fight wars or to compete with one another. We get breech loading cannons, we get infantry rifles that fire 20 rounds per minute, we get steel battleships. There's also a rise in conscription. Conscription is kind of like the draft. It's where you have Germany, for example, and I do apologize, I have done a lot of research on Britain and Germany, so that's where a lot of my examples will come from because that's my fallback, that's what I'm most comfortable talking about. But like in Germany, they required their young men to actually serve once they got out of secondary school. So like you served, like 4 years of active duty, and then you had like 8 years of National Guard duty, and then following that you had, the government could call upon you in the next following like 8 years in order, if there was an instance where, you needed to be called up. because of war or something. And that's kind of what conscription is. So you get a rise of men into the army, and as a result of that, you get an increase in spending into the military because, well, how do you give, a million man army, because now you can have that because you're essentially requiring your populace to be in the military, but then how do you feed that military? How do you move that military? How do you, supply that military? They need rifles and ammunition and, boots and coats and things like that. And so there is going to be a huge increase in the expenditure of, the military from just, 1900 until 1914 when World War I starts. And for a lot of countries, it wasn't necessarily the army. Like Great Britain, for example, has never really had a large army. Of course they don't, because they're an island. They have a navy. And so their focus was really on the buildup of the navy. Britain actually built a new ship called the HMS Dreadnought, which was basically a super battleship meant to instill fear in the other countries. And I'm sure that it did. Like, think about it. You've never seen something this large built out of, steel, and, on a graying morning, this thing pulls into harbor, and it probably looked like a monster of kinds. It would have definitely been something that would have inspired fear. And Germany responds to this by spending money in their navy to compete with the British. And this is going to be one of those things where in military history in general, you are either a land power with a great army, or you are a sea power with a fantastic navy. There has never been a country that has had both, with one exception. And that exception is the United States. Not to toot the US's horn, but that is because we are, at least geographically speaking, unique. We have a lot of land, therefore we can have a lot of populace and have a large army, but we also have a very large expanse of coast. And so we also have a very large navy, and we are the only country, at least in the last, 500 years, if not more, to have both a strong army and a strong navy. So just for Germany to try and compete, this is going to bump up Germany's expenditure. That's why, if you look at their increase in spending, it's 158% there. And that's not just because of their army, but because they're also putting money into a navy. And a navy is so much more expensive to not only build, but to maintain. An army is easy, right? Like a person loses their rifle, you give them back a rifle, which might cost $200. But if you accidentally hit something like a mine in a still battleship, then it's going to take not only months to repair, but it's going to take a ton of money to repair, and it took a ton of money to build that thing. So navies are just exponentially more expensive than armies are. And yeah, that's where a lot of Germany's expenditure comes from, is them trying to compete with the British Navy. Now, militarism, it's going to be an incredibly powerful force in the 19th and earliest century in Europe. And while militarism alone doesn't start World War I, the reason why I'm talking about it is because it fueled the arms race, and it undermined the role of diplomacy as a means of resolving disputes. So that's why it is a cause, is because we all have new toys, and we wanted to share our new toys with our neighbors forcefully because we didn't want to talk, use our voices instead of our fists. And that's why it's a cause, because it undermined the role of diplomacy. Next up, we're going to be talking about alliance systems. Now, leading up to World War I, there was no single country that dominated Europe. Instead, there were several, air quote, great powers, such as France, Russia, Germany, Great Britain, and Austria-Hungary. And all of these powers are, in Central Europe, and they are vying for the upper hand and making alliances with or against one another. Now, usually in Europe, there's this thing called the balance of power, and usually there are 1 to 2 large powers that butt heads with each other but control the continent. So, you can look back through time and you see, Spain was the power at one point. France was the greatest power at one point. Great Britain was the greatest power at one point. The Holy Roman Empire, which is the predecessor to Austria-Hungary and Germany, was the greatest power at one point. And usually there is one, maybe two people who have the overall say of Europe. Now, what makes World War I kind of unique is by the time we get to it, there is not one power who is overall of Europe. You have several large powers vying for control of the continent. Now, military leaders thought that making defensive pacts and agreements would tip the balance of power into their favor. They believed that these alliances would create peace through strength because if you attacked one country, it would result in a massive response from its allies. And that's exactly how alliance systems are supposed to work. It's kind of like people know that if you mess with Israel, you're messing with the United States because Israel and the United States have an alliance with each other. And that might or might not deter people from attacking one country or the other. And that's really what these military leaders were thinking is like, oh, well, if I'm friends, Germany's like, well, if I'm friends with Italy and I'm friends with Austria-Hungary, then, people aren't going to want to attack me because they know that they're going to go to war with these other two countries. And that's how alliance systems are supposed to act. The theory went that, yeah, this threat would deter attacks because you have, one group of people versus, one country. And just before World War I, we really see Europe starting to create this very tense balance of power and start to split into two main groups. The first one is the Triple Alliance, and it consisted of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy. And then we had the Triple Entente, which was France, Great Britain, and Russia. And as we will see with World War I, instead of alliances forcing, people to talk it out, it doesn't happen that way. Instead, it transforms what was a small civil crisis into a massive war. And then, basically has like a domino effect on the countries that were in alliances with one another, defending one another because that's what they said they would do. And that's why we talk about militarism first, because part of the reason why militarism plays right into alliance systems is that you want to make military defensive pacts. Why is that a thing? Because militarism is a thing, right? We want the military to be first and foremost at the front of our country, which meant that diplomacy lacked, which means we're not going to talk things out. And so even though there's going to be a bunch of misconstrued stuff, it's not going to matter because nobody's going to use their words. Onward to imperialism. Now, imperialism, if you don't know, is when a country increases their power and wealth by bringing additional territories under their control. Almost everyone should know what imperialism is because we live in America and the United States is an imperialist country. Great Britain did actually drive the scramble during this era in their attempt to gain the Suez Canal in Egypt. Russia then fought for territory in the Middle East, and all European countries tried to claim and carve up bits of Africa and Asia because of the raw materials that those two areas could provide. So tensions around these areas started to run high. In Africa, for example, who had a ton of resources, the European nations, they felt like they needed to, in order to run their factories and their other industries, they needed the things that Africa had to offer because it's rich in natural resources like rubber, like gold, like diamonds, like vibranium. No, I'm just kidding. Vibranium's not real. That's, that's a Marvel thing. Captain America's shield's made out of it. Wakanda forever. Okay, sorry. Onward. Now, this need for national security and pride in, European countries, what it did is it led to the idea that territories and colonies are going to be required for these countries to be secure or to appear strong, or even to project their empires, right? There's this old saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, and I always just thought that that was a saying, but then if you look at the turn of the century, in the 1900s, the very early 1900s, they meant that literally. That's not metaphorically. The British Empire was so expansive in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, that the sun quite literally never set on the British Empire, because when it was rising in one area, it was setting in the other area, because they had colonies all over the world. And so there's this scramble for, imperialistic colonies. And what this does is it increases competition, it increases a desire for greater empires that, lead to confrontation between Europe and other countries. But most importantly, and I can't stress this enough, because yes, I'm talking about imperialism in a context of World War I and how it is a factor of World War I. And, yes, European countries are going to be confrontational with one another, but above and beyond that, you guys, let's not forget that there were native peoples who were involved in all of this, and that it destroyed so many of their lives. They were living in these colonized territories, and the effects of this race for colonies for the European empires, it can still be felt in every country that it touched, even today. The British Empire just fell in 1998, okay? That was literally 20 years ago. And it's hard to imagine that there was colonies, active colonization all the way until the turn of the 21st century, but there is, and there was. And it's very important to me that, yes, we're talking about it in a European context right now, and yes, it pushed the world into a global conflict, but imperialism and colonization ended up being so much bigger than that. And it's because when a colonizer leaves the colonized country, that doesn't mean that the effects of their presence just cease to exist. It continues to be felt very, very long after they leave. So let's not forget that the importance of imperialism for World War I is, yes, it caused tension between European countries, but imperialism is so much more important than just how it affected Europe, okay? It's about how it affected the countries that Europe imposed its will upon. Okay, so let's talk about nationalism. European countries at the end of the 19th century, they're often going to include multiple nations. And that doesn't really sound that odd to us, but for example, in the state of Belgium, there were two main national groups. There was a Dutch group and there was a French group, and they each spoke different types of languages and they had different culture. And this was normal for the majority of countries in Europe. And it's kind of, think of it like there's one powerful national group that dominated over a bunch of smaller minority nations. It's kind of like set up like the United States, right? We have the federal government, and the federal government is over all of the state governments, right? And that's kind of how this is, but let's imagine if the United States and each state, it had a completely and totally, different religions, different languages, different cultures that were respected and not just assimilated. But let's pretend that that's kind of how it's going on. That is exactly what nationalism is in the early 20th century. Now, just to give you an example of what I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it included 13 different nations. There were 16 recognized languages and 5 major religions just within that one country, right? But within that one empire. And think about just how much controversy it is here when, being in Texas, right? How much people get upset when, Mexican Americans, speak Spanish. And it's like, we already get upset about stuff like that. Can you imagine having 16 different recognized languages or 5 different religions? We can't even accept that Christianity is slowly becoming not the #1 religion in the United States. Can you imagine if there were 5 of them? It would cause a lot of issues today. Well, it caused a lot of issues back then too. So nationalism itself, what happens is it grows out of the 19th century as a result of Enlightenment thinking, right? So the Enlightenment era, which promoted equality, it promoted freedom, it promoted democracy, and all of those things. Now, then in the 1800s, the mid to late 1800s, we get a lot of reforms, politically speaking. We get a lot of revolutions, like the French Revolution. Even the United States had its revolution just at the turn of the century from the 17 to the 1800s. And, pretty much what those political reforms and those revolutions do is it gives people who had previously been excluded, it gives them a voice. And I don't mean everyone, obviously. I mean, women in this country this year just have, it's been 100 years since women in this country could vote. 100 years. That's it. Right? So, I mean, I'm not saying it gave everyone a voice, but, it did give more people than ever before a voice, if that makes any sense. Now, the reason why this is important is because people started to identify with more local things, right? So they started to identify with their nation rather than their kingdom or their king or their country. Perfect example is we are all living in Texas, right? And it's really funny because I'm not from here. I'm from Nevada, and I'm from Las Vegas. And it always baffled me because when I would go places with my Texas friends, like I took my friend, from Texas to where were we? I think we were in Hawaii, which, is still technically the United States. But like, when people are abroad, when Texans are abroad, people abroad will be like, hey, where are you from? And Texans are like, I'm from Texas. And it's so funny because like in my brain, my immediate answer is I'm from the United States. But like for Texans, you say, I'm from Texas. Why is that? It's because you associate yourself, you identify first as a Texan and second as an American. Right? Now that's what's happening here with all of these countries. They're not identifying as Austro-Hungarian. They're identifying as Serbian or, whatever the other smaller countries are broken up in. And they start to see this thing as being like, wait a second, we want independence. Right? Because at the end of the day, we identify as this small nation as Texans instead of Americans. So maybe, if our culture was fundamentally different here than it was the rest of the United States, we had a different language, we had a different culture, we had a different religion, all of those things, it would make sense for us to want to break off. And that's what's happening all across Europe in the early 1900s. And it threatens the boundaries of previous empires, right? The boundaries of the states of Europe, because there really weren't borders that matched national groups. There were borders that matched the empire. So think of it like the percentage of people in Texas, there are something like 65% of the people who live here are Hispanic. So by those terms, technically Texas should be a part of Mexico again, right? Because the majority of people who live here speak Spanish and they are Hispanic, which means they, either come from Mexican descent or they are born in Mexico and they come to the United States. What that means is that where is the border supposed to be, right? Ethnically speaking, South Texas is basically Mexico and Texas. So should South Texas be a part of Mexico because they have more culturally and, language, religion, those types of things, they have more in common with Mexico than they do the United States? And you can see how the lines can get really blurry really quickly. And the US wouldn't like that because Texas is ours, right? And so the feeling of nationalism, it threatens the borders of traditional Europe. And obviously European empires don't like that. And a lot of the origin of World War I, it's actually based in the desire of Slavic peoples to no longer be a part of Austria-Hungary, and instead be their own country, be a part, form a country called Serbia. Like, it was a country, but it was a territory. It'd be like, Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. They're not a state. It's kind of like that. And Serbia wanted to be, if they had to be a part of an empire, they wanted to be a part of the Russian Empire because ethnically speaking, they had more in common with the Russians than they did the Austro-Hungarians, who are Germanic peoples. We're not going to get into that conversation because this is not Western civilization. But just to give you an idea, the reason why I talk about nationalism last is because nationalism led directly to the war. It is the most direct of the indirect causes. Nationalism, in various countries throughout Europe, not only contributed to the beginning, but it also contributed to the extension of the war in Europe. It is the most direct of the indirect causes, because we will talk about it in just a second on the next slide why that is. So most of you have grown up in the age of terrorism, an age that was supposedly sparked by the 9/11 attacks. But really, what if I told you that we've been living in the age of terrorism for more than 100 years, and that it all started with a young man named Gavrilo Princip? Now, I've argued this before, and I'm sure I will argue it again, but I've argued that Gavrilo Princip is probably one of the most important, if not the most important figure of the 20th century. And hear me out, because I'm sure many of you are sitting there going, what? But there's Martin Luther King Jr., and there's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and there's, Gandhi, and there's Mother Teresa. There's all of these amazing people in the 20th century that, shaped it. But Gavrilo Princip, more than anyone else, shaped the entire course of the 20th century. And that is because Gavrilo Princip is the reason why there was a Second World War. Because he was the reason why there was a first. And there is nothing in the 20th century that changed it or shaped its course more than the world wars. Now, Europe, it's in this big, giant historical game of Russian roulette. If you don't know what Russian roulette is, it is where you take like a revolver and you empty all the bullets out and you put one back into the chamber and you slam it shut and spin the revolver's chamber and you go, oh, are you feeling lucky, punk? And you have like, a 1 in 6 chance that perhaps the bullet's not in the chamber. Now, Gavrilo Princip, he's in Sarajevo, Serbia. He is a young nationalist who believes in Serbian independence. He is also, just a side note, dying from tuberculosis. Now, while Europe is in this giant historical game of Russian roulette, each country has taken a turn, taking the revolver and pulling the trigger. And up until this point, up until 1914, there has never been a bullet in the chamber. Now, on June 28th of 1914, Gavrilo Princip takes that metaphorical revolver, he points it at the skull of the old world, and he pulls the trigger, shooting a bullet directly into its brain and killing the old world in order to usher in a new one. Now, it's plausible, that he was part of a much larger revolutionary cause that believed in order to build a new and better world, you had to completely and utterly destroy the old one. And I'm sure that that's hard for us to comprehend and understand sitting in our 21st century classroom, or in this instance, behind our phones and our computers and our tablets and other smart devices. It's hard to understand the early 20th century because we are surrounded by this idea that terrorists armed with weapons of mass destruction could kill hundreds of people in the blink of an eye. And, sometimes it's not about how many people you kill. Sometimes it's about who they are. And often it's not the terrorist attack that changes the world, but the response of the victims that does. Now, Gavrilo Princip, he killed 2 people on June 28th. And in doing so, He, one, started the age of terrorism, and two, changed the course of the 20th century. And he does this in a way that almost makes me want to believe in fate. And I personally don't believe in fate. I do believe in destiny. I believe that, you can do things and you have some sort of say in where you go in life. Fate means that no matter what you do, you're going to end up at point B from point A, and you don't have any say in how it goes. It's just always going to end up that way. But that's one of the many things that history does, is it challenges my personal beliefs. I don't believe that things are predestined to happen, but this is one of those times where I'm like, there's no way that this wasn't predestined. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and unlike the royalty of today, he was going to have some real power when he ascended the throne. He was going to really be in charge of a lot of people's lives. And he was in Sarajevo that day witnessing some military maneuvers, and like today, the parade schedule was printed and distributed to the people. There's about 20 assassins or so that line the streets along the motorcade route. They are all armed with pistols, some are armed with hand grenades, and they are all armed with cyanide pills. Cyanide is a poison that is supposed to kill you. If you've seen Captain America, the first Avenger, it's what, the guy, when Cap, pulls that one dude out of the submarine and he bites down on his fake tooth and he's like, Hell Hydra, and then he dies. That's cyanide. So Gavrilo Princip is among these 20 assassins, and they are all kind of waiting for their moment to kill the Archduke. Now, the first couple of assassins don't really see an opportunity because at the end of the day, it's about killing the Archduke, not harming, Serbian citizens. And the motorcade passes this corner, and one of the assassins jumps out from the crowd. As the motorcade passes, he throws a bomb, which, think of it more like a hand grenade by today's terms, at the passing car. And in a move that is quite excellent by the Archduke, he basically kicks the door open, and the grenade bounces off of the Archduke's car and lands in the gutter of the street. And when it blows up, it injures about 20 guards and civilians, so 20 total. It kind of hits the car behind the Archduke and explodes and hurts some civilians that are standing there. And the car with the Archduke speeds away to a local safe house, and the entire parade is canceled. Duh. And so the other assassins are just kind of like, well, I guess we have to go along our business, right? Go about our business, and it just is what it is. Several of them being upset that their scheme didn't work. Now, Gavrilo Princip, who was way down the line, he was one of the last assassins. He was a complete and total last resort. He was upset by the botched assassination attempt, so he goes to a local deli, his favorite place to get a sandwich, in order to grab a bite to eat. And less than an hour later, the Archduke, he decides that he needs to go to the hospital where the injured are from the explosion to check on their well-being, because he, like many world leaders, is like, I will not be, my life will be dictated by terrorist attacks type of thing. And his, chief guard guy is like, absolutely not, you're going to stay here. And he's like, well, I'm the Archduke, I do what I want. And so they all get in the car, and on the way, his driver, who doesn't exactly know where he is because he's not from Sarajevo, it's just one of the Archduke's, guardsmen who's driving, he ends up taking a wrong turn. And when he realizes it, he stops the car and puts it in reverse. But see, cars are a new commodity, and this new technology is somewhat finicky. So as soon as he puts the car into reverse, it causes it to stall. And as it does, the car stalls, as it happens, the car stalls right outside of the deli that Princip just walked out of. And to his amazement, to Princip's amazement, there's his target, in an open-top stationary car where he is in an elevated position and he's only about 6 feet away from him. He is completely stunned by his luck. He reaches into his jacket pocket, raises his gun, and fires shots into both the Archduke and his wife, killing them both. Now, what are the odds of that, something like that happening? It's literally considered to be one of the most wild coincidences in all of human history. I mean, think about it, you guys. How many times do assassins in a failed assassination attempt get a second chance to go after their target? Like, never. That doesn't happen. So because of this, monumentous moment in history, because this is where historians and other people, they point and they go, this is the start of World War I. Gavrilo Princip assassinates the Archduke and World War I is triggered. Now, since this is such a monumentous moment in history, I think a lot of people forget that this, at the very core, is a terrorist attack. And it was a huge upset. Of course, as we all know, one man's terrorist is another man's liberator. And I do mean that literally. Back then, and even today, Gavrilo Princip is considered to be a national hero to the Serbs. You can actually go to where he fired those fatal shots. There is a plaque hanging on the brick wall where on the corner where he actually killed the Archduke. There is a plaque on the ground with his feet like molded into it, and you can stand where Gavrilo Princip stood in order to get Serbia the freedom that they always wanted. So let that really sink in, right? Because World War I was so massive, and it triggered World War II ultimately. These two massive wars where, millions of people died. And in Serbia, Gavrilo Princip is quite literally a national hero, a place where you can go and you can see, where they gained their independence. Now, the assassination of the Archduke leads to a domino effect declaration of war. This is because of those alliances that we were talking about earlier. Now, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And it's okay if you don't follow this along. I just want you to understand what kind of shit show this is, okay? So we have Austria-Hungary, who is the empire that Serbia is within. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and they are well within their rights to do so, right? Because Serbia is a part of their empire. This could have just been a civil war. Instead, what Austria-Hungary doesn't know is that Serbia has been talking to Russia, and Russia is like, oh yeah, you're Slavic people too, so we will absolutely and totally defend you, Serbia, mainly because Russia wanted Serbia to be a part of its empire. And so Russia gets involved to defend Serbia and declares war on Austria-Hungary. Now, Germany, seeing that Russia is mobilizing, they are an ally of Austria-Hungary, so they declare war on Russia. Now, France has an alliance with Russia that essentially says that if Russia is attacked by 2 or more countries, they will come to their aid. Well, Germany and Austria-Hungary just declared war on Russia, so France is drawn in against Germany and Austria-Hungary because of their alliance with Russia. Now, Germany attacks France, moving through Belgium, which is a neutral country. However, there is an open alliance that has been around for about 100 years at this point, that if you breach Belgium neutrality, you will bring Great Britain into the war. And the reason why is because Belgium is like a hop, a skip, and a jump away from the British Isles, and it can be used for a land invasion. So Germany attacks France through Belgium, knowing damn well that the British are going to get involved, which they do, pulls Great Britain into the war, who is allies with Japan, who enters the war because they're friends with Britain. And then later on, Italy and the United States are also going to enter the war on the side of the Allies. So it's just kind of like this domino effect. So instead of alliances preventing everyone from going to war, it just escalates the war. Why, you ask? Well, because they were all secret alliances. Austria-Hungary didn't know Serbia was friends with Russia, and Russia didn't know that Austria-Hungary was friends with Germany. Germany didn't realize that if they declared war on Russia, France was going to get involved. They did know, however, that if they marched through Belgium, Britain was going to get into the war. But what they didn't know is that Britain had an alliance with Japan, which affected the other side of the world and a lot of German colonies where they got a lot of their oil and things of that nature. So to make a long story short, nobody knew who was in an alliance with whom. That's why nowadays alliances are no longer allowed to be secret and they all have to be open. Moving right along, let's talk about American neutrality. So now that we know why Europe went to war, let's talk about what is going on over in the United States. Because as war engulfed Europe, Americans are going to find themselves very sharply divided. Because at the end of the day, the United States is a populace that consists of multiple nationalities. Now, British Americans are going to side with their nation of origin, believing that, like other Americans who associate Great Britain with American ideologies like liberty and democracy, they feel that the British are right. There's going to be a lot of anti-British groups, Irish Americans and German Americans who are going to identify with Germany and see Great Britain not as a liberator or, a vessel of democracy, but as an oppressor and an imperialist. There's also going to be a third group of people that consists of pacifists, social reformers, and feminists. And all these people are going to remain convinced for a very long time that, America shouldn't be involved at all, and they're going to lobby against American involvement. So you have the people for Great Britain, the people against Great Britain or for Germany, and then the third party, which are people who are against the war, period. Now, when war breaks out in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson is going to proclaim American neutrality in his speech before Congress. And this is going to be on August 19th, 1914. Now, you don't have to remember what I'm saying here, okay? But I want you to really listen to the type of language that Woodrow Wilson uses here, okay? This is what he said, quote, "The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable that some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in the monumentous struggle. Such divisions among us would be fatal to our peace of mind, and might seriously stand in our way of our duty as one great nation at peace, the one nation ready to play the part of mediator and counselor of peace. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action." Now, Woodrow Wilson, at the end quote, Woodrow Wilson, he uses a lot of pacifying language there, right? He uses neutral, he uses, peace of mind, he uses it's our duty to be a great nation at peace, to be a counselor or a mediator of peace, we have to be impartial. That's all passive language. And a big reason why is because most Americans favored neutrality at the time, because of course we did. We have an isolationist mentality. Now remember that the United States is separated from both Europe and Asia by two very vast oceans. We've also experienced in the early 20th century, an unchallenged sphere of influence on the American continent. Now, overall, Americans simply just don't see how the war in Europe is going to possibly affect them. The question as to whether or not America should make military and economic preparations for the war starts to spark a very heated debate between the pacifists, between the pacifist and the interventionalist, right? People who don't want to be involved and the people who want to intervene. Now, Wilson is going to kind of stand in the middle. He felt like he didn't really want to piss off either group. And so this is kind of where we go. We'll talk about what happens in the next slide. Now, it's going to take until 1916 for the United States to really start thinking about the possibility of going to war. President Wilson, he's going to win re-election. He literally ran on a campaign of keeping America out of the war. But by the time we get to April of 1917, the U.S. government has decided that Germany has simply gone too far. And we list, or I say but really President Wilson is going to list 4 main reasons why the United States should now enter the war after Europe has already endured 3 years of bloodshed. Now, the first one It's probably the most cited example of unrestricted submarine warfare ever. It's the one thing that you learn about even when you're a kid, and that is the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was a British ocean liner that carried 1,900 passengers and crew aboard, but it also had 173 tons of war munitions that was being transported from the United States to Great Britain. But wait a second, I thought we were neutral. Weren't we neutral? If we were truly neutral, then we wouldn't have been transporting war munitions to Great Britain. We would have equally gave munitions to Britain and Germany, which we did not do because America was never neutral. We always were on the side of Britain and France. Anyways, a German U-boat attacks the Lusitania because they had put out, Germany as a whole, put out that if you were around the waters of Great Britain in like the English Channel, that it is, essentially open season. They had a blockade around Great Britain, and if you entered those waters, they had every right to fire upon you. Of the 1,900 passengers and crew aboard, 1,100 people are going to perish. It's very tragic. It just so happened that the torpedo that the U-boat had shot at the Lusitania hit the part of the ship that was carrying the war munitions, and it like blew the ship sky high. And it was actually close enough to land that people on land could tell that there was something that had happened out in the ocean, but it was too far for help to really come. And bodies are going to be washing up on the British shoreline for like 2 or 3 years after the Lusitania sinks. It's quite tragic. Now, the second reason that we cite for going to war is the Zimmermann telegram, and I know that a lot of people know what this is as well. So there were British cryptographer, somebody who deciphers code. They received a telegram that the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, sent to the German minister in Mexico. And basically what the telegram said is that if the United States, what it said is that if the German minister could get Mexico to invade or provoke the United States, then when Germany won the war, it would offer United States territory back to Mexico in return for joining the German cause. And I know that that sounds a little silly, but I mean, Mexico would gain back Arizona and New Mexico and Texas and parts of California. And so it probably would have looked like a really good deal, but at the same time, it never actually reaches the German minister in Mexico because British cryptographers decipher the telegram, or perhaps it did reach it and we just knew what was going on. It's kind of unclear. But what Germany wanted, and the reason why this is a big reason why we go to war, is because Germany wanted to start a conflict between the United States and Mexico. Any guesses why? If you guess to keep the United States out of the war, then you are correct, because the US, like I said earlier, has an isolationist mentality, right? Our brain is America first, everyone else second. So if there is a war going on right here on American soil, do you think we're going to go to Europe and help? No, probably not. On top of that, there were German atrocities that were committed during the march through Belgium. And that is the third reason why we cite the America going to war. On August 4th of 1914, the German army started to cross the border into Belgium. Along the way, they were trying to tell the Belgians that, hey, we don't want to harm you. We just want to march through to get to France. Seriously, please just let us pass. The Belgians, understandably so, are completely and totally unwilling to allow such a thing to occur without offering some kind of protest. So instead of just allowing Germany to pass, they quite heroically stand and fight. And I do say heroically because Belgium is a tiny little country with a tiny little army, and there's a huge German war machine coming at them. And what the Belgians do is they destroy bridges, they block roads, they blockade areas. And even though the nation's small and ill-equipped army could absolutely had no hope of defeating the German invaders, what they did do is they managed to slow them down enough to such an extent that the carefully drafted timetables of the planned invasion had to be completely rewritten from scratch on the fly. And it totally messes up everything that Germany was trying to do. It also gave the British the opportunity to mobilize and get to where they needed to be, and it gave the French the opportunity to mobilize and get to where they needed to be. So, we really need to tip our hats to the Belgians, because they didn't have to stand and fight, and they did, and it was quite extraordinary that they managed to, halt the German invasion for as long as they did. Now, the reason why I bring this up as being one of the causes is because, see, Great Britain does a really good job of using propaganda to get America to be on their side. We took a note out of British propaganda for World War II, and that's why our World War II propaganda campaign is top notch, because the British know how to do it. Now, the British produced these sensationalized stories of German outrages that were happening all across Belgium along the course of the invasion. Now, here's the thing, is yes, there were absolutely atrocities being committed from Germans to the Belgians. However, these stories that the British were publishing were claiming that German soldiers were eating Belgian babies, that German soldiers were hanging Belgian nuns between church bells and wringing them to death, that German soldiers were crucifying dozens of farmers along the roadside, and so forth and so on. Now, pretty much all of that is completely and totally false. It didn't happen, and it's just a way to sway the home front into understanding the importance of this war. But there was cruelty from the Germans to the Belgians. They just weren't eating Belgian babies like cannibals, and they weren't ringing nuns to death in church bells. Now, to put it into perspective for you, because like I said, there was cruelty here, the total Belgian deaths during the war amount to something like 100,000. There were 40,000 military deaths and 60,000 civilian deaths. Of those civilians who did die, they died as a direct result of the war. There were 6,000 of them who were just straight up executed for being in the way. Nearly 1.5 million Belgians are going to be displaced because of German occupation. Displaced means that they become refugees, they flee their country. The German army actually constructed a 200-kilometer long electrical fence that is later going to be called the Dodendraad by the Dutch, and it claimed the lives of nearly 3,000 people trying to escape Belgium over the course of the war. 120,000 Belgian citizens of both sexes are going to be forced into labor camps during the war, and nearly half of them are going to be deported to Germany to work in prison factories and camps, and several of the men are going to be sent to the front lines to work as infantry. So yeah, there was definitely cruelty on the side of the Germans to the Belgians, but they weren't eating Belgian babies. Now, lastly, but of course not least, the fourth and final reason that we claim we got into World War I was because of democracy. We quite literally went to war for democracy. Now, the Central Powers, the Triple Alliance, German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were ruled by emperors. And for Woodrow Wilson and other peoples of the free world, the war kind of was looked at as this titanic struggle for the preservation of democracy. And if they won, right, if the United States, France, and Great Britain won, then it was a defeat of autocracy and Prussian militarism. And it was the preservation, the prevailing of democracy as being the superior political setting. So there's this idea that America is fighting for the representation of people. Now, to drive it home, on the 2nd of April, 1917, President Wilson, he appears back before Congress, and he asks for a declaration of war. Now, his speech is very long and very complex, and I'm not going to make you read it, but what I am going to do is I'm going to read you a portion of it, and I want you to listen for the difference from what he said in 1914 and his pacifying language to what he's saying now in 1917, asking for a declaration of war. He says this, quote, "Property can be paid for. The lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be. The present German submarine warfare against commerce is warfare against mankind. The German policy has swept every restriction aside. Ships of every kind, whatever their flag, their character, their cargo, their destination, their errand, have been ruthlessly sent to the bottom of the ocean without warning. American ships have been sunk, American lives taken. I advise that Congress declare the recent actions of the Imperial German government to be, in fact, nothing less than war against the government and the people of the United States. Neutrality is no longer feasible or desirable where the peace of the world is involved. The world must be made safe for democracy. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek not material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. It is a fearful but right thing to lead this great peaceful people to war. We shall fight for the things of which that we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of people to have a voice in their own government, and for the rights and liberties of small nations." End quote. Now, 4 days later, Congress is going to take Wilson's consideration, into, well, I guess they're going to take his proposal into consideration is the words I'm trying to find. And yeah, Congress is going to declare war, and the United States is going to become a formal partner in the war to end all wars. As Wilson's administration is soon going to discover, however, declaring war and making war are going to be two very different things. And the former is going to require like an abstract statement of ideas and, justifications and, of course, 2/3 congressional majority, because that's what declaring war takes. But to make war means the massive mobilization of virtually every sector of American society. It's the mobilization of the military, of industry, of our economy, and of course, probably most importantly, public opinion.